I worked as a seasonal ranger in the Appalachian region of western North Carolina for 3 years, and I want to be clear that I am not someone who easily gets spooks in the backcountry. I did 2 tours overseas before I got the ranger position, and I have seen things in both contexts that have genuinely frightened me. And I know the difference between being frightened by something real and frightening yourself with a specific anxiety that comes from being alone in remote terrain after dark. What happened on a Tuesday night in late October of my 2nd season was neither of those things. It was something I do not have a category for and have spent the better part of 2 years trying to find one. My patrol area covered approximately 40 square miles of high elevation terrain in the Pisgah National Forest, including 3 trail systems, 2 backcountry shelters, and a section of the Appalachian Trail that ran along a ridge at around 5,000 feet. The nearest staffed ranger station was about 18 miles away by road, which meant my overnight patrol shifts had a specific quality of self-reliance that I had gotten comfortable with over 2 seasons. My base was a small patrol cabin at the end of a Forest Service road, stocked for 2-week rotations, with radio contact to the main station and satellite communication as a backup. The radio worked when it wanted to. The shift in question started normally. I had done my afternoon trail checks and was back at the patrol cabin by 8 in the evening. October in the Pisgah, at that elevation, had already taken the leaves off most of the hardwoods, and the nights were cold enough to use the cabin's wood stove, which I had going by the time I settled in to log the day's observations. Everything about that evening was routine until about 9:30 when my radio came on. It was not a transmission. It was static, which by itself was not unusual. The radio had intermittent static throughout the season depending on atmospheric conditions. What was unusual was what came through the static. A voice, partial, broken up by the interference, but present enough to register. A man's voice. I was certain of that, though I could not make out specific words in the first transmission. The static came in bursts rather than continuously. And in the gaps between the bursts, the voice was there, low and consistent, the specific register of someone speaking at a normal conversational volume, rather than using the projected voice of someone trying to be heard. I responded on the standard channel. Nothing. I tried the backup channel. Nothing. I logged the time and noted the transmission in my patrol log and continued my evening routine. 20 minutes later, the radio came on again. Same static pattern, same voice in the gaps. This time I caught a word. Not clearly, not with the certainty I would need to report it as a definite transmission, but I heard what sounded like a location name. The name of a trail in my patrol area. The one that ran to the East Ridge viewpoint. About 1.5 miles from the patrol cabin on foot. I want to be precise about my decision making at this point because the decision I made is the one I have replayed the most. I had a voice on the radio, possibly identifying a trail location, coming from an unidentified source that did not respond to my responses. The responsible interpretation was a hiker in distress with a failing radio who had managed to get a partial transmission out. The other interpretation I was not going to commit to based on a partial word in static. I got my gear together, logged my departure time, and started toward the East Ridge Trail. The forest at that elevation in late October at night is a specific environment. Without leaf cover, the canopy does not block the sky, and the star field above the Pisgah ridgelines on a clear October night is exceptional, which meant I had more ambient light than I would have in summer. The trail to the East Ridge was one I knew well enough to walk without significant headlamp use in that ambient light, which is what I did for the first half mile, conserving the headlamp battery for when I would need it at the ridge. I heard something at the trail junction about 3/4 mile from the cabin. Not the radio. Not static. A sound from off the trail to my left into the leafless hardwood forest that dropped away down the western slope of the ridge. A sound that I am going to describe as breathing, because that is the closest single word for it, though what I heard was more specifically the sound of a large volume of air being processed by a large set of lungs at a slow and steady rate. Not an animal breathing, not a human breathing. Something between those things in a way that my mind kept refusing to settle on a category for. I stopped on the trail and turned my headlamp on and directed it into the hardwood forest to my left. The beam showed me the first 40 or 50 feet of the slope, bare gray tree trunks and the brown leaf litter on the ground, and the specific quality of an Appalachian hardwood forest in late October that looks completely like itself and shows nothing beyond the tree trunks that the beam cannot reach. I held the beam in one position for 2 minutes and saw nothing. I swept it across the visible slope systematically. Nothing. The breathing had stopped when I turned the headlamp on. I stood at the trail junction for several minutes after that with the headlamp on, listening. The forest was what it should have been at that elevation on a cold October night, quiet in the way of a forest that has gone into its late season dormancy, nothing unexpected in any direction the headlamp reached. I continued toward the east ridge. The viewpoint at the end of the trail was an exposed rock outcrop that looked east across a series of ridgelines, a location that I checked periodically because it was occasionally used by backcountry campers who did not have permits, and because the exposure made it a dangerous place to be caught in weather. I reached it and found it empty. The rock outcrop, the clearing around it, the immediate tree line, empty. I stood on the outcrop for a few minutes and tried the radio again. The static was gone. The channel was clean, and I raised the main station and reported my position and the earlier transmission and was told that no distress calls had been logged that evening on any frequency. The duty officer asked if I wanted to call for backup, and I said no, that I had checked the area and found nothing and was heading back to the patrol cabin. I was about a quarter mile from the cabin on the return route when I saw the light in the cabin window. The patrol cabin had its interior light on when I had left, and I had not turned it off when I left, so the light in the window was not itself remarkable. What was remarkable was the shape visible through the window glass. A silhouette at the interior height of a standing person moving across the window from left to right at a slow walking pace. Someone was in my patrol cabin. I stopped on the trail and processed this with the specific discipline of someone trained for exactly this kind of situation. There were several explanations. A fellow ranger who had driven up the Forest Service road for an unscheduled reason. A hiker who had taken shelter, which was not standard protocol but which occasionally happened in poor weather, though the weather that night was clear. Someone who had no business being in a secured patrol cabin. I noted the explanations and moved toward the cabin at a controlled pace and approached the front entrance directly. I knocked on my own cabin door and identified myself as a ranger. No response. I tried the handle. The door was locked, which it had been when I left. I unlocked it and went in. The cabin was empty. The interior light was on exactly as I had left it. The wood stove was burning at the level I had set it before leaving. My patrol log was open on the table to the page I had been writing. The radio was where I had left it. The coffee mug I had been using was where I had left it. Nothing was out of place, and no one was in the cabin. I stood in the single-room cabin and looked at every corner and checked the bathroom and looked under the bed frame and found absolutely no indication that anyone had been inside. I then went back outside and walked around the cabin's exterior with my headlamp, checking the windows and the ground around the foundation. At the west-facing window, the one I had seen the silhouette through from the trail, I found something in the dirt of the foundation perimeter. A single footprint. One. Not a boot print, not a shoe print with a defined sole pattern. The kind of impression a bare foot makes in soft dirt. A single bare footprint. Human in proportion, at the base of the window I had been watching from the trail, facing the glass as though someone had been standing at the window looking out. The temperature at that elevation on that night was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. I went back inside and locked the door, and I stayed awake for the remainder of the night, sitting in the chair, facing the door, with the radio on. I submitted a full written report the following morning when I reached the main station. The duty officer reviewed it and cross-referenced it with the transmission records and confirmed there had been no radio traffic on any channel originating from my patrol area that evening. The footprint was in my supplementary report. The supervisor who reviewed the report asked me to confirm that the ground at the cabin foundation was soft enough to hold an impression. I confirmed it. He noted it and the report was filed. No further investigation was conducted that I was informed of. I finished the season and did not return for a third. The specific reason I did not return was not the events of that October night, or not only those events. It was what happened on the 2 subsequent nights of that rotation. On Wednesday night, the radio came on at 9:40 with the same static pattern and the same voice in the gaps, and this time the word I caught was not a trail name. It was my own last name. And on Thursday night, my last night of the rotation, I found a second footprint at the west window, this one more clearly defined than the first, and beside it, placed carefully on the windowsill in a position that required someone to have set it there deliberately, a single smooth river stone that had not been there the previous night, and that had no natural way of getting from any riverbed in the area to a windowsill at 5,000 feet on its own. I took the stone with me when I left. I still have it. I cannot explain it. I cannot explain any of it. But I can tell you that the Appalachian highlands at elevation in late October have a specific quality after dark that I had spent 2 seasons getting comfortable with. And that whatever I encountered across those 3 nights was not a part of that quality, was not a part of anything I recognized from 2 seasons or from anywhere else in my experience. And that the river stone on the windowsill is the specific detail that closed my 3rd season application before I ever opened it. I have spent 4 years as a seasonal ranger in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachian Highlands, 2 in Virginia, while the 2 in North Carolina. And I want to say something about that specific work before I get into what happened during my 3rd season, because the context matters. Ranging in the Blue Ridge is different from ranging in more heavily visited park systems. The terrain is demanding and the visitor population is smaller and more experienced than what you see in the national parks, and the ranger to acre ratio means that when you are on a solo overnight patrol, you are genuinely alone. Your nearest colleague might be an hour's drive away. Your radio might not reach the main station from certain terrain positions. You develop a specific self-reliance and comfort with isolation that becomes part of how you process your environment. My 3rd season was in North Carolina, a district I was new to, but that had enough similarity to the Virginia terrain I had worked that the transition was straightforward. I had a patrol partner for this assignment, which was less common in my experience, but which the district supervisor had decided on for certain high-elevation patrol areas based on some incident reporting from the previous season that he described as requiring additional attention, without specifying what the incidents had been. My patrol partner was a ranger named Tomas, who had worked in that specific district for 6 years and who knew its terrain and its patterns in the specific deep way that only years of repetitive presence produces. Tomas was a methodical person. I say that as a specific professional assessment rather than a personality description. He logged everything. He followed protocol with a consistency that never felt bureaucratic because it was clearly how he actually thought rather than how he performed. And his incident reports were the most precise I had encountered in 3 seasons. He was also someone who did not talk about things he had not fully processed, which meant that when he said something, it had been considered before being said. I established this description of Tomas because it is important for evaluating what he told me during our patrol that October and how he said it. We were doing a night patrol of the High Ridge section of the district on a Thursday in mid-October, a route that took us along approximately 6 miles of the AT corridor and back, checking the 2 shelters in that section and the 3 designated camping sites along the ridge. We had been on the route for about 2 hours and had cleared the first shelter and 2 of the camping sites without incident. The night was cold and clear, and the October ridgeline had the extraordinary quality that the Blue Ridge has in late autumn. The star field above the open ridge sections was exceptional, and the views east and west in the available star and moonlight were genuinely beautiful in a way that I never stopped appreciating. Regardless of how many overnight patrols I had done, we were between the 2nd and 3rd camping sites, a stretch of trail that ran through a section of dense spruce and fir at the higher elevation section of the ridge, which had a different character from the hardwood sections lower on the slope. Spruce fir forest at that elevation has a specific quality at night that the hardwood forest below does not share. It is denser. It produces less ambient sound, and the canopy blocks the sky more completely than bare hardwood branches do, which means the transition from the open ridge sections to the spruce fir corridor had a quality of moving from open to enclosed that was always noticeable. We had been in the spruce fir section for about 20 minutes when Tomas stopped walking. He did not say anything. He simply stopped in the middle of the trail and stood still. And I stopped beside him, because stopping beside your patrol partner when they stop without explanation is the correct response, and Tomas knew that I knew that. We stood on the trail, and I waited, and I looked in the direction Tomas was looking, which was off the east side of the trail into the spruce fir forest that descended the slope there. He stood still for approximately 30 seconds and then said, very quietly, that there was someone standing in the trees about 40 yards off the trail. I looked in the direction he indicated and I could not see anyone. I told him this and he said to look for the gap in the vertical lines, meaning the tree trunks, that something was standing between two specific trunks that did not have the same vertical character as the surrounding trees. I looked more carefully and I understood what he meant. There was a shape between two spruce trunks at the distance he indicated that was not the shape of a tree trunk. Slightly wider, slightly less uniformly vertical, positioned in a way that suggested a person standing rather than a tree growing. Tomas called out in the standard way, identifying himself as a park ranger and asking the person to come to the trail. The shape did not move. He called out a second time. The shape did not move. We stood on the trail looking at it for what I estimate was about 3 minutes, and it remained entirely stationary. A person standing motionless in dense spruce fir forest 40 yards off trail on a cold October night is unusual in a specific way that requires a response, and the response Tomas and I had agreed on for this type of situation was that one of us would move toward the person while the other maintained visual contact from the trail. Tomas said he would go, and I said okay, and he left the trail and moved into the spruce fir forest toward the shape. I watched him move through the trees, and I watched the shape at the distance ahead of him, and I kept both in my visual field simultaneously. Tomas moved carefully and quietly and covered about 30 yards of the 40 before the shape moved for the first time since we had noticed it. It stepped behind the tree trunk on its left side. A single step, slow, the movement of something adjusting its position to maintain concealment rather than the movement of someone who has decided to leave. Tomas stopped when it moved, and I called to him that it had stepped behind the tree on its left. He confirmed that he saw which tree and moved toward it. He reached the tree and I could see him check both sides of it, turning his headlamp in both directions. He stood there for a moment and then he came back to the trail. He said there was nothing behind the tree and nothing in the immediate forest around it. No tracks in the spruce duff that he could identify clearly. The ground under spruce being difficult for prints. Nothing. He logged it in his patrol notes as an unidentified visual anomaly, which was the professional term for something you had logged correctly and had no further designation for. We continued the patrol and reached the third camping site and the second shelter without further incident. The shelter was occupied by two thru-hikers who were doing a late season section, and we spoke with them briefly and they reported nothing unusual on the trail. We turned back south and began the return route, and everything for the next hour was completely routine. The second encounter happened on the return route in the hardwood section below the spruce fir corridor, and I was the one who saw it first this time. We were moving at a good pace back toward the patrol vehicle, and I was slightly ahead of Tomas on the trail when I saw something on the trail itself, not off the trail but on it, approximately 60 yards ahead where the trail made a slight curve and the tree line on the right side came close to the trail edge. A figure, standing on the trail, facing us, not moving. Visible in the combined moonlight and my headlamp beam as a human-shaped form on the trail surface. I stopped and told Tomas, who came up beside me and looked. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that the figure on the trail was too tall. Not dramatically, not impossibly, but proportionally wrong in the specific way that a person with body proportions outside the normal range looks wrong at a distance. Too much length in the torso relative to the legs, or too much leg relative to the torso. He could not specify which because the lighting did not allow that level of detail, just the overall proportion being wrong in a way his eye was registering. We both called out. The figure did not respond. We began moving toward it, and at approximately 30 yards it stepped off the trail to the right into the hardwood forest and was gone in a single step, the way something disappears when it moves behind a tree trunk that is large enough to conceal it completely. We reached the point where it had stepped off and there was nothing in the immediate hardwood forest on the right side of the trail. Tomas swept his headlamp in a full arc into the forest and we listened for the sound of movement through the leaf litter, which in October is acoustically significant enough that a person walking through it would be clearly audible. We heard nothing. We walked the remaining 2 miles back to the patrol vehicle and we did not speak very much during that walk. I was processing what I had seen, and I believe Tomas was doing the same. When we reached the vehicle and were driving back toward the ranger station, Tomas said something that I am going to reproduce as accurately as I can. He said that in 6 years of patrolling this district, he had seen 2 things that he could not log correctly, meaning 2 things that had no professional category in the incident reporting system, and that both of them had been in the same section of the ridge, the transition zone between the hardwood and the spruce fir, and that what we had seen tonight made 3. He said this without any dramatic quality, in the same methodical way that he said everything, and then he changed the subject to the route plan for the following night's patrol. I asked him directly the following morning what the previous 2 incidents had been. He told me the first one was a set of tracks he had found leading to a creek crossing that had no corresponding tracks on the other side, which he had attributed to the specific way a crossing in low water could eliminate track evidence, but which he had logged separately because the track pattern before the crossing was inconsistent with any species he could identify. The second was a sound he had heard on a night patrol alone that he had never been able to categorize, which he described as a sustained vocalization with no natural source he could identify, and which he had heard from 2 different directional points within the same 5-minute period, suggesting either 2 sources or a single source moving faster between the 2 points than any animal he could account for. I completed my season and did not return for a 4th. The decision was mine, and it was not made in a dramatic way. I simply found that when I thought about returning to that specific district, the thought produced a quality of reluctance that I had not experienced toward any other patrol area in 3 seasons. Tomas returned. He is, as far as I know, still there, which means he has now spent 9 years in a district where he has 3 incidents that he cannot log correctly, and whatever accommodation he has reached with that situation is his own, and I have not asked him about it because I do not think the answer would make me feel better about any part of this.